Well, I'm the last speaker of the day, and I must apologize that I will be speaking in English, although, of course, it could be worse. I could be speaking in the Serbian of my parents, but fortunately, I won't be doing that. I wrote a book in which I suggested that design might be a kind of language, and perhaps, as one discovers from the process of translation, that language itself might be a kind of design. It's a way in which we understand who are part of our group and who are not. And the rules of language keep changing in case those who are not part of our group catch up and find out how to sign like us. So my daughter's generation in English quickly decided that when they wanted to say something was good, they used the word bad. And when they wanted to say something is very good, they used the word sick. When I was editing a magazine in Milan, Domus, it was bilingual. And it was always fascinating to see that the English texts were invariably half the length of the Italian text. And when I tried to make the two equal by giving Italian the same sharpness that English has, of course, quickly one understands that language is also a kind of good manners, and Italian approaches subjects in a more roundabout way than English does, which is all some way to say, bear with me if what I'm trying to say is not as clear as it might be. I even found myself at a conference earlier this year, one of the TED conferences, where one of the most interesting presentations, apart from a security consultant who showed how the 3D printing techniques that we've just seen can be used to print a feasible working weapon, having smuggled the printer through passport and security control without any problems. But the thing that really struck my attention was an economist from Yale who described himself as a linguistic economist. And his starting point was that behavior might be shaped by language. And he began by showing us a diagram which looked at the savings of various nations as a percentage of gross domestic product. And of course, Greece comes out by far the worst. They save hardly anything. And the other scale is Germany. But it's not simply about poor countries, because he found several examples of nations in Africa or in Asia in which they had quite high percentages of savings. And his hypothesis was that those languages which have a clear, defined future tense, like English, like most of the Latin languages, are less likely to save than those like German, which are more vague about the future. The idea being that you don't save if you think it's something that happens then, but if it's now, then you might start to save. Interesting hypothesis. And he did some more work. He found those countries which are bilingual, Switzerland, Belgium. He found that, of course, it was the Dutch-speaking Belgians and the German-speaking Swiss who save more than the Romance languages. I trained as an architect, but I realized I couldn't actually be one because I had very little sense of how you turn an idea into a three-dimensional object. So I became a critic, a writer, a journalist, but always looking at design, always having that sense that design was a fascinating way to understand the world around us, and that it was something that needed to be communicated not just to the design priesthood, people who wear black suits somewhat like my own, but the outside world, because design and architecture matter a lot. And of course, as a critic, your job is more or less to stop bad things from happening. But more recently, I've become a museum director, where I still have the role, I hope, of trying to communicate the meanings of design. But if you don't make things happen as a museum director, you get fired quite quickly. I work at the Design Museum in London, and one of the issues that we're talking about today about culture and commerce, which which are both aspects of design, I think are thrown into very sharp relief in the museum context. Our museum doesn't have a big collection, and it looks forward rather than back, and it tries to show where design is going rather than where it's been. But that's not something which is the case with all museums of design. The world's very first one, here in London, the Victoria and Albert Museum, was the product of the first World Expo, the Great Exhibition of 1851, and that was an expo which, for a change, made a profit, and some of it was used to build the Royal College of Art in London, and some to pay for this museum. Now, the purpose of the museum, when it started, was to show British manufacturers how they might make products that would compete better with those of other nations. In those days, of course, it was Prussia, Austria-Hungary, and France, and obviously hasn't been very successful because Britain is still desperately trying to find ways to compete with the manufacturing of nowadays Taiwan, China, Korea, etc. And anyway, very quickly after it opened, Victoria and Albert completely changed its policy. It stopped being a museum of mass production, which is where I think design comes from, and became a museum of decorative arts, a very wonderful museum of decorative arts, but one which really sees design as wonderful objects that go back hundreds of years, thousands of years, which are not so much about what we see design as being about the future. So the second model for design in a museum was, well, this is the latest incarnation of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. The first building, well, actually it started off in a house, then moved into a building in 1938. But the Museum of Modern Art accepted design into a museum, but only on the basis that we pretended that it was sculpture. So inside the museum, you might find some Swedish ball bearings next to a Leger painting of ball bearings, but all that you would see in terms of a caption with the ball bearings was the date, the material, and the name of the maker. I think design needs to have other ways to communicate in a museum. The example I often think about is if you were the director of an art museum and you were fortunate enough to have Picasso's extraordinary painting Guernica, this amazing scream of outrage against the atrocities in the Basque city during the Spanish Civil War. If you had that painting in your museum, it would be interesting to show an image of the aircraft which destroyed that city. It would be interesting to show the newspapers which reported the atrocity to the world, but in a way it would distract you from the work of the artist, which in itself is a self-contained statement about the horrors of war. On the other hand, if you happen to have a museum of aircraft and you had one of those Junkers aircraft which bombed Guernica, it would be absolutely essential to say what this machine had done and why and what happened with it. And for me, design needs to have those stories about the process of how things are designed and made, who uses them, who designed them, and obviously it's not always the named designer. Design happens in groups, not only in inspired individuals. And even things like what did it cost and for how long was it in production. Another model of the design museum is the Pinakothek de Moderne, it's the Neue Sammlung, which actually has one of the world's greatest collections of design. It's in Munich. They've been collecting since 1900, so it's very hard to keep up with them. And in a way, this, which is the first space you see when you go into the museum, really sets the agenda for how they see design. So you will see a sense that design is partly about process. There's the wooden model, which is the basis for a car body at the top. There is a bit of technology there. You can see an early generation flat screen monitor from Apple. You can see a chair or two, which is one of the obsessive tropes about contemporary design. And you can see the Dali lips, which are a reminder that some forms of design can take on expressive qualities of art. So design is about many things. Of the new generation of design museums in Europe, among the first, built at the same time as my museum, the Design Museum, was this little building in Val-am-Rhin, which is on the German border with Switzerland and France. And it began life as a museum of chairs. It was Frank Gehry's first building in Europe. And this was a look at one clear aspect of what design might be. This is one of their typical exhibitions about the furniture of Rietveld. And of course, one of the things that happens when you are on a commercial site with a campus is that things change around you. So the team at the Vitra Design Museum now have to deal with the interesting situation of Vitra, the furniture company, has built what they call the Vitra House. It's designed by the architects Herzog de Meuron, and it's a showroom for the company's products, which of course has free admission, which shows you the design classics but manufactured new. And one of the things that the team at the Vitra Design Museum say is, well, we have trouble trying to explain to people why they need to pay to see our designs, and they're so much in such worse condition than those shiny new things across the street. Our things are all battered. This is where my museum will be moving in 3 years' time. It's an existing building built in 1962, which has been empty for some years. And our plan is to turn it into a 10,000 square metre space in which we can really explore the new ways in which one can present design in a museum. And for us, that is a mixture of things. It's understanding that design is a wide range of things. And we run the museum almost as some kind of multiplex cinema, so that any one time you might have a blockbuster show, Christian Louboutin shoe design. You might have art house, which could be some of the kind of work that we've just seen at Reuniu, which we've also shown that kind of work, and then something somewhere in between the two. So right now we have a show about the impact of design on sport. We show architecture. People say it's hard to show architecture in a museum. I'm not sure it's true. You can do extraordinary things with materials and photography. This is again the sports show. It's showing how, not so much why these beautiful objects, which some of them are, but how over the years the way that design approaches these objects changes with the use of materials and forms, and how rules adapt. We've had historical shows. Sosthester is one of the key designers of the 20th century, a designer who managed to span this great divide between designers' culture and designers' commerce. He was able to make both critical objects and mass-produced typewriters for Olivetti. We show fashion. This is Hussein Chalayan. Graphic design. This is Javier Mariscal. This is part of our collection. We're trying to show a range of everyday objects in a museum context. This is the Louboutin show. Well, today's seminar is about the creative economy and design. And I sometimes worry about this word design. It's one that has been used so much that sometimes one feels it's been almost rubbed dry of any real meaning. Back in the 1980s, there was the phenomenon of the designer mineral water bottle, which was to say that it was the most expensive version. There was the rather unfortunate American property developer, Donald Trump, who was once described as having a designer wife. And we're not really quite sure whether that was a job description or her attributes. The creative economy is one of those terms that has started to spread around the world like wildfire. In the same way that 10, 20 years ago, every city that was looking to establish itself on the international map looked at Bilbao and tried to find something like the Bilbao effect, which was the iconic architecture of a gallery. When I hear the word iconic, I reach for my revolver. The reason that Bilbao has become a success story, in as far as it has, is many things. It's an economic policy, it's a political strategy, and yes, it's one high-profile building, but that is by far from what actually makes the system work. But there is a problem with these high-profile architectural showpieces. Politicians and mayors love them. So in Barcelona, the same phenomenon was used at first relatively successfully, but we shouldn't be too starry-eyed about what Barcelona is now. There are some of those great buildings built 5 years ago, which are now shuttered and empty. And the same phenomenon of high-profile architecture has ended up in Valencia, where the city has more or less been bankrupted by its addiction to building large buildings designed by Santiago Calatrava, which tend to look like very large dead lobsters. Design, for me, is both culture and commerce, and that can be a very problematic way. We've seen today this extraordinary range of presentations which have taken us from the troubles of the Cape Town slums, to attempts to sell new lavatory seats. Can this really be the same subject? What do these things have in common? Design has a history, I think, of being quite schizophrenic. One of the inventors of the modern profession of design was the French-American Raymond Loewy, who used to boast about streamlining the sales curve. And he was extraordinarily proud of the fact that when Lucky Strike hired him to redesign their cigarette packet, he managed to double sales by changing the colour of the pack from green to white. It's the kind of achievement that even the most cynical designer today might keep rather quiet about. And design has become something that has now developed the space and the maturity and the confidence to start to question itself as well. There is now a phenomenon which we call critical design, which is, this takes as its starting point, not that design is meant to answer questions, not that it's meant to make us feel better about ourselves, not that it's meant to make people buy things they don't necessarily want by applying fluorescent lime green paint to them, but that it might be about asking questions. It might be exploring some of the darker sides of what design operates in the territory. That can also be uncomfortable because there are real problems that face us. And while critical design might be interesting, I think we might feel rather concerned about the concept of critical dentistry or critical aircraft engineering. But the conference today really, in the Brazilian context, needs, I think, to make up its mind. Is what Brazil is looking for to create another Samsung, and as a country which actually has Embraer, there's no reason why it couldn't? Or is it in the business of social equity, which is another of the themes that have been raised today? Or could, and perhaps it's true, they both might reinforce the other, that a thriving industrial sector might also lift more people out of poverty. For me, in a museum, that question about culture and commerce is always present. I remember the example of the Guggenheim Museum in New York, which 15 years ago made an exhibition about the work of Giorgio Armani. And when the New York Times discovered that Armani had made a donation of something like $15 million to the Guggenheim, the Times suggested that the museum had sold its dignity far too cheaply. That's pretty harsh. Are you only going to do fashion shows about dead designers? Not very exciting. But I think as a design museum, you have a responsibility to make your exhibitions not look like a shop. So who is the designer that most people would now like to make an exhibition about in a design museum context? Well, it's Jonathan Ive at Apple. But how could you possibly make a show which didn't look like one of their superstores? Well, one thought might be that you might compare Apple and its history with Olivetti. Olivetti was once the Apple of its day. It was one of those pioneering Italian manufacturing companies which had a big social mission. It had Sozzas and Bellini. Sozzas brilliantly anticipated the iPod by, for the first time with Olivetti, designing a typewriter that looked like a consumer product, Valentine typewriter. He coloured it bright red with orange spools, and suddenly office equipment had gone into different territory. And if we think about Apple's history, it's the same story. And comparing those two companies, I think, gives us some other clues about the world, not always very comfortable ones. You might compare the working environment of the design teams at Olivetti and those at Apple. And one of the really exciting things about Olivetti was that they allowed their leading designers, Mario Bellini and Ettore Sozzas, to maintain parallel studios. They worked at the company headquarters, but they also had studios in Milan itself, in the Corso Venezia, where they were allowed to pursue their own projects. Jonathan Ive is in some ways the most privileged designer in the world, with the largest research budget, but he sits at his beautiful desk at Apple headquarters. The address is one infinite loop, which tells you almost everything you need to know about it. And he is completely cut off from working for anybody else, which might make one think that the Olivetti example should have worked better. but unfortunately Olivetti could never make the adjustment from mechanical production and went bankrupt, and Apple is now the most valuable company in the world. Just to give you a range of the sorts of things that design might be, and maybe also to interrogate a few thoughts about them. People use the word function a lot. On one level, what could be more functional than a Formula One car? It's designed for peak performance, it's tested in wind tunnels, it's shaped by those processes, it looks like sculpture, but everything about it has a tactical, physical purpose. It's manufactured by men in white coats who cut sheets of carbon fibre as if they were couture seamstresses making a Paris collection. But of course, it's absolutely useless as a means of transport. This is a project which looks at something to do with the social mission of what design can be. It's the One Laptop a Child project, which is the product of many people's efforts. Nicholas Negroponte at MIT had the idea that the way out of poverty was affordable computing, and Yves Behar gave it the cute lime green finish. This is another form of design. Shepard Fairey, the Obama poster, in some ways this is an attempt at authenticity. It's trying to hark back to the days of the New Deal when politicians meant what they said. But of course it's an image which Shepard Fairey stole from a photographer and got into all sorts of terrible legal trouble. This is Hussein Chalayan, which is described as fashion, but to me it's more about his identity as as a Turkish Cypriot who moved to London and uses film, objects, installations, and yes, garments, really to ask questions about how we see ourselves and what clothes mean to us. This is a miniature fluorescent bulb, a designer who went into manufacture on their own account to make an energy efficient but quite expensive miniature fluorescent, which of course does away with the need for a shade. They're all forms of design, all very different forms. My talk is, as I say, about the landscape of design, where it's going. So let me leave you really with 4 ideas about how to navigate this landscape. The first is that sense of function. What do we really mean by function? Form follows function was the ritual mantra of the 1930s, but really a better question is not to say what is the function of a chair, but to ask what is the function of a throne, or a chair to sell for $50 rather than $500, or a chair to be used in a nursery. Identity is the second one. And identity is a key issue for me. Design, on the one hand, is entirely borderless. Jonathan Ives' iPhone is designed in California, assembled in Shenzhen in China, and it uses components from 15 different countries. Is that American design? Is that British design because of the nationality of the man who led the design team? We are in a period when the old idea of a factory at which huge chunks of steel arrived at one end and finished cars came out at the other are over. Assembly is something so different. Identity is also something, though, that is self-consciously used to manufacture a sense of who we are and where we belong. And we're better to voice that thought than here in Belo Horizonte, where Kubitschek and Niemeyer between them shaped the idea of modern Brazil. You could say here is politics as a species of art direction. My third thought is about memory. Technology really has robbed us of the relationship we always used to have with our possessions. As a species, we like to measure out the passing of our lives with the things that we have. Every scratch and dent on a watch is something that we measure. We look to inherit things from our parents and to pass them on to our children. And yet the way that the digital revolution has swept away analog products now leaves us without most of those things. My father gave me his typewriter, but I couldn't possibly leave my daughter my laptop. It would be unusable in a joke. You see a certain advertisement in some of the financial newspapers for watches. They show an elegant but greying banker, master of the universe, with his son, and the line is, "You never actually own one of our watches, you just look after them for the next generation." Well, the watch is only kept alive by massive advertising of that kind. The reality is, of course, that you can tell the time rather more appropriately with your mobile phone. And that mobile phone will also be a camera, a bookshop, a GPS system, the means that we communicate with other people, and yet it will only last you 9 months if you're an early adopter, maybe 2 years if you're more responsible, and then they go to landfill. And I used to be appalled about this, but then of course you need to actually think about really the questions that design hasn't maybe asked enough. On the one hand, it looks the ungreenest thing you can do to trash all that technology. And yet, think about the trade-off. It's not just the camera that's gone and the film that's gone, or the books that's gone. It's the distribution system that goes with them. It's the movement that people actually go to buy those things. Maybe there's a trade-off. Maybe we could yet be guilt-free consumers. I know that the lithium that comes from the high deserts in Chile is a bit of a problem. And then finally, let's think about technology. Open source is a wonderful thing, and yet technology has this extraordinary way of producing unintended consequences. The car was meant to be a personal mobility system, not to produce traffic jams. The shipping container was meant to be a way to ship goods around the world, but they ended up destroying most traditional shipping ports because they weren't fit to handle those sea containers. And the semiconductor was meant to be a way to control temperature and amplify things, and it produced the internet. And for me, one of the depressing things is the way that so many technologies, which begin by being extraordinarily open, end up being extremely repressive. Let's forget that Google's slogan is "Do no evil," and in the early days this was a great way into free information, and now we know that they are giving our data to the CIA and posting our details to the tax man. There is unintended consequences. And for me, the big question that design has to look at is how the future of the city can survive with this technological revolution. Internet e-commerce does away with the need for all those stores in town. It produces lots of big boxes on the outskirts of town, warehouses, but it leaves the city centre empty. So can technology fill the gap? Is the internet the city square? Maybe it is. It certainly has that range of things from libraries to vice and crime on the edges of it. Is Twitter the democracy wall in Beijing putting up posters, or is it the lavatory wall in which anonymous slogans are put up, free of the responsibility of people knowing who you are? Design is many things, but the most exciting thing about it is that it keeps changing its shape and goes on being about different things. Thank you.